Hi there, welcome to our session on copyright, copyleft, or copy wrong, the essentials you need to know. My name is Donna Murray and I'm excited to talk to you about copyright today. I know that sounds like a pretty dry and uninteresting topic for most of us, but it's really an important topic to cover as we think about using instructional materials in the classroom because teachers, educators have some certain rights around using copyrighted content for instructional purposes, but sometimes that space is unclear, and I'm hoping to give you some tools and some considerations to help you identify when it's appropriate and legal to use copyrighted content in your classroom and when it's not. So welcome. As I said, my name is Donna Murray and I serve currently as a digital teaching and learning consultant with the Department of Public Instruction. This slide includes my email address and my username on Twitter if you'd like to follow me there. So again, this isn't going to be like a total exhaustive cover of all things copyright because goodness, there are copyright lawyers out there who know all the intricacies of copyright law, so it's a lot of information. This isn't that level of depth. This is really just about, again, the essentials to help you understand how to vet materials and make decisions about whether or not you can legally use that content in your classroom. So these are just the essentials, and it's important that I shared this disclaimer with you because I am not a lawyer and this is not legal advice. So if you have any questions after this session, please make sure you contact your district attorney to find out information about specifically how a question relates to your district policies and or for further clarification around something that I shared today. So it's not legal advice. This is just for informational purposes and to give you a basic foundation around the knowledge of copyright. So that's what we're going to start with, is just the basics of copyright law, but we're also going to layer that knowledge on some scenarios that are common for educators, things like, can I read a book and record myself reading it and post it on my school website? Things like that. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those scenarios today and how the digital landscape has kind of changed things up when it comes to using copyrighted materials. Okay? So the first thing we need to do is really identify what copyright means. And copyright is actually a subset of intellectual property. And intellectual property, as it says on the screen, includes the rights that creators have to restrict others from using their works. So creators do have these intellectual rights to their creative property. And there are lots of different types of intellectual property. Copyright is just one of them. There's other things, including trademarks, even trade secrets is actually intellectual property. So we're looking through the lens today of copyright and not really, again, things like trademarks. The intent of copyright law is to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for a limited time to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. So let's kind of pull that apart for a minute. So the intent of copyright law is to, for a limited time, give rights to the authors and inventors, the rights to whatever it was that they've created. The key piece here is that the focus really isn't on the inventors and authors holding on to these rights or having these rights forever and ever. The intent is that the rights would only be granted for a limited time in order to allow society to at some point have the rights to that creative content so that society can progress. So that was the original intent of copyright law, is to say, if you create something, you have rights to that creative content. But you're only going to have those rights for a limited time, because at some point, if our society and culture is going to continue and grow, we want to be able to build off of what you've created. So I think that's an interesting lens, because when we talk about copyright, it is about the rights of the creator, but there's also a time when it becomes the rights of society, so that we could build off of that. And so copyright applies to anything that is original in creation, and it has to be fixed in some tangible way. So that's, I think most folks, when we think about copyright, we're thinking about a book that's copyrighted. But it could also be things like a song, a movie, a piece of software. It could also be material that is digital. So even content that I post online, so maybe I have a blog and I'm doing blog posts, that content is copyrighted because it is fixed in a tangible way, in a tangible medium. So this is what copyright covers. And this is a fact that I've come to realize not everyone is aware of, which is that copyright is automatic. So I remember always thinking that something wasn't copyrighted unless it had the C with the circle around it, or something wasn't copyrighted unless you actually filed something with the Copyright Office to designate, to kind of qualify that the content you've created has been copyrighted by you. And that's not the case. Copyright is automatic. As soon as something is created by someone, original authorship, and it's in a tangible format, it's automatically copyrighted. It doesn't have to have the C with the circle around it. So we always need to assume when we come across content that someone has created that it is completely copyrighted, all rights reserved. And it's important to know that you can't copyright facts or ideas, but you can copyright the expression of those facts or ideas. That space may sound a little bit tricky, because you may say, well, what about nonfiction, right? How do I copyright something that's nonfiction? It's because you're copywriting the expression of that nonfiction. Maybe I'm publishing a science textbook and it's filled with facts, but I am expressing those facts in a certain way, and that creative expression through the lens of the structure and design of that textbook can be copyrighted. So it's even a bit tricky when we think about facts and ideas versus expression. Let the key word be expression. Even if I'm taking facts and putting them in some sort of tangible format, if I add expression to that through the design and the structure, then that can be copyrighted. So as a creator, I have exclusive rights that are given to me immediately. As soon as I create something in a tangible format and it's the expression of my ideas, I have exclusive rights. And those are these rights listed here on this slide. I can make translations, I can make and distribute copies. I have the right to publicly perform or display the content I've created, and I have the right to make derivative works. So I can make adaptations to my content. Those are rights that I hold as the rights owner, as the copyright owner, and those are given to me from the start when I create something, and it's mine. So the copyright term, we talked about the fact that the law states you should only own the copyright to your creative works for a limited time. The copyright term varies across the world. In most parts of the world, or many parts of the world, it is the life of the creator and 50 years. So from the time, if I create something, from the time that I pass away, plus 50 years, then the copyright term ends and my content belongs to everyone, to the general public. In the United States, it's longer than that. It's the life of the author, the life of the creator, plus 70 years. So we're going to talk a little bit about why there's a discrepancy there and how the United States ended up with this longer term in just a minute. Once that time frame has ended, so if I create something and then I pass away and 70 years passes, then that content falls into the public domain. And you've probably heard that word before, or words before. The public domain means that something no longer is subject to copyright. And there are a couple of ways to land in the public domain. You can do like I just mentioned, which is to, the time period has passed for someone to own the copyright, and therefore it falls into the public domain. But you can also put something into the public domain. I could create something today and say, what's mine is the world's, and I could actually license it with a public domain license to say, hey, I'm not holding on to any rights. What's mine is yours. You can do whatever you want to with this content. So that's just a couple of ways that something could fall into the public domain. There was a time when something would fall into the public domain if it had not been registered with the Copyright Office. But that no longer is the case. Now, as soon as something is created, it's automatically copyrighted. So there are some things that fall into the public domain for different reasons, but most cases it's because the term of copyright has expired, or someone puts it in the public domain, takes the copyright off of it and says what's mine is the world's, and licenses it that way. And just about anything can be done with content in the public domain. It really depends on where the work is used and where the work originated. But when we're talking about specifically United States content, if something's in the public domain, you can pretty much do whatever you want to with it. You can commercialize it. You can create adaptations, derivative works from it. You can post it online. You can make copies of it. You can do whatever you want to if it's something that lives in the public domain inside the United States. And so I mentioned that the copyright term is different in different parts of the world. And this is just a quick history of copyright terms in the United States. So back in 1790, the length of the copyright term was 20 years. So if I created something today, 20 years from now, whether I'm alive or not, it becomes ownership of society. In 1909, that was extended to 56 years. And then in 1976, we actually split copyright into kind of two buckets: individual copyright and like business copyright, a corporation copyright. So in 76, it became what most of the world still is, which is the lifetime of the author and 50 more years. For a corporation, it was, and at that time in 76, was 75 years. So it really didn't have anything to do with the lifetime of the author. It was about the corporation itself. And this person who worked for the corporation, that work belonged to the corporation. And so it was really a time frame from the time it was created. Doesn't matter who created it in the corporation. From the time it was created, 75 years later, then it would become ownership of the public. And in 1998, an additional 20 years got tacked on to the individual copyright term. So we are now at lifetime plus 70 years. The corporation requirement or copyright term was extended to one of two things: either 120 years after it was created or 95 years after it was published. So if if there's something that's been created within the corporation but it's not been published to the world, then the time frame's a little bit different. But the big takeaway here is that for the general population, as an individual, when I create something, that copyright belongs to me as the copyright owner for my lifetime, and then 70 years after I'm gone, and then it falls into the public domain. So think about that. There's content that was expected to belong to society, and because of that law in 1998, it took 20 more years for that to happen. So, and you may see a link down on the bottom of this slide that reads, in 2024, Mickey Mouse will finally enter the public domain. Sort of. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit here. But let me first give a quote from a a statement of dissension from Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, and this was related to the extension of that copyright term, because when that copyright law passed in 1998 and added 20 more years, there was a lawsuit against it, and because they said it was against that statement of progressing society. It's not the intent of law to have someone have an extended term. It's supposed to be a limited time to own copyright. So I appreciated this statement, and I pulled out part of the quote. It says, "It is to make the copyright term not limited, but virtually perpetual," talking about the 20-year extension. "Its primary legal effect is to grant the extended term not to authors, but to their heirs, estates, or corporate successors." So the argument here is that, this additional 20 years isn't limiting the copyright term. It's basically making it a forever term because essentially it's, the author is most likely not going to reap the benefits of owning that copyright term that's so long, especially since, they've been gone for 50 years already. But it's really to give an extension of the ownership of that copyright to whoever inherited that copyright and the estate of that original copyright owner. So, that's a pretty valid argument, I think, is that we're extending it 20 years, but who are we extending it for? It's certainly not for the content creator. It's for whoever now owns that copyright, which is likely going to be an heir, an estate, or a corporate successor. So, you can, I'm sure, make arguments either way, but the original intent was that after a limited time, it would belong to society. So that's why the lawsuit was filed. So this is called the copyright duration and Mickey Mouse curve. Think about Steamboat Willie, which was the first animated version of Mickey Mouse. Steamboat Willie was set to fall into the public domain right about the time the law got changed. And then it was about to fall into the public domain again once the law had changed and the time frame was extended. And the law got changed again. So there's a pattern here, and that's why it's called the Mickey Mouse curve, because the expected expiration date based on copyright law was going to be a certain period in time for Steamboat Willie, Mickey Mouse, to fall into the public domain. And it was lobbied to change the law and extend the time period, and that happened. So that meant that Mickey had some more time before he fell into the public domain. And then the law was expanded again. And so this Mickey Mouse curve is really predicting that in 2023, the way the pattern is so far, that there will be lobbyists again who will advocate that the time frame needs to be extended. So we'll see if it becomes, life of the author plus, 90 years once we get closer to 2023. Although some are arguing that Disney is not as concerned about it anymore and that it's okay that Steamboat Willie falls into the public domain. And if you're already thinking about how you're going to make money selling Mickey t-shirts, hang on just a second, because this is really about Steamboat Willie Mickey, who, by the way, looks very different than the other iterations of the Mickey picture, the Mickey Mouse design. And you also have to layer in trademark law. This is one of those instances where trademark law and copyright law have a very blurred area, because Mickey is also included in trademark law because it's the visual representation of the company. So Mickey is a very tricky space, but just know that if Mickey does fall into the public domain, it's only Steamboat Willie Mickey. It's only the representation of Steamboat Willie Mickey from the actual moving picture of Steamboat Willie, the first moving picture of Mickey Mouse that's going to fall into the public domain. So anyway, this just proves that sometimes there's a lot of outside forces that affect law. It's called the Sonny Bono Act, the 1998 law change. It's called the Sonny Bono Act because he was the congressman that sponsored the bill. So again, we're not talking about just copyright specifically with the Mickey Mouse example, because in that case, trademark plays a role. Mickey is used to identify the source of the product or services. So it gets a little bit tricky, and there's another link here on this slide that even has some more information if you're really interested in learning more about how Mickey is playing a part in copyright law. And on January 1st, 2019, copyright nerds were pretty stoked about the fact that finally some new content was coming into the public domain. One of the things that fell into the public domain was Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening poem by Robert Frost. I have been able to post this poem on this slide without breaking copyright because now it belongs to the public. I don't even have to give credit. I have included the public domain license image on here to signify that this content is in the public domain, so that if anyone sees this, they can do some research themselves to verify that fact and know that this is something that I didn't just get permission to use, but that is actually in the public domain and anybody can use it. And there are lots of organizations out there that have really started focusing on putting content into the public domain, and then the digital world has really enabled us to be able to access that content much more easily. And so these are just a couple of links of examples of how the Met and the Smithsonian have actually published images that are openly licensed so that you can, again, use them however you want to. They are in the public domain. Look, here's some examples of people who have taken original content and remixed it. So they have taken some images that now belong in the public domain. They've most likely downloaded them from the Smithsonian website, put it in some sort of editing program, and kind of made their own thing. And those remixes of that open content is perfectly legal to do because the content is in the public domain. So I know this has been a pretty in-depth history of copyright law, but I hope that knowledge will now inform us a little bit better when we're talking about copyright and the lens of education. So there are a few specific pieces of law that speak to copyright and education. Those are Section 110 of copyright law, Section 107 of copyright law, and the TEACH Act. And we're going to talk briefly about a couple of these and more in depth about the fair use. So there are some limitations to exclusive rights. That's basically saying if I own the copyright to something, I created this creative work and it's mine and I own the copyright, I automatically get some exclusive rights. But there are some limitations to that, and that's important to society for multiple reasons. One of them is that Section 110 allows me as an educator to perform and display in certain parameters copyrighted content. So if, for example, let's say that Robert Frost poem was not in the public domain yet, maybe it was still under the copyright term, I would have the right, according to copyright law, to display that work. I could display that poem in a face-to-face teaching environment of a nonprofit educational institution. And that does include a classroom, or the fact that this part of copyright law would allow me to display it is certainly helpful as an educator, because that means I can, project it on the wall with my projector, or I could show it, or I could read it to the class, and I'm not breaking copyright law based on my interpretation. The one thing to note about that is that it is for face-to-face instruction only. So this is not specific to the digital world that we live in now, where and especially not to 2020 and 2021 when we've done so much remote learning. This is very specific to face-to-face. The TEACH Act, and I'll skip over fair use for a few minutes, but the TEACH Act is actually an addition to copyright law that really does talk more about that virtual learning landscape. And that's fine and dandy, except that I don't know if you can tell just by me scrolling, but it's quite lengthy in its explanation of exactly what that entails, what the parameters are. The TEACH Act is very specific about the parameters for that virtual learning environment. It has to have more secure structures in place. But where we sometimes like to hang our hat, and appropriately so, is Section 107, which is around fair use. And I have a link to more information here specifically about fair use, but we're going to dig into it in the next few slides. So I'm just going to move on and talk about the things that qualify for fair use and how you really know, because it's not black and white. So some of the certain types of use that qualify for fair use could include, as you'll see down here on this fourth bullet, teaching. But it can also include things like criticism, comment, news reporting, and scholarship and research. So here's the thing to note about this, because the intent here is that you may hold most of the rights, but there are still things that are allowable by society as being fair use of my copyrighted content. And again, thankfully, that includes teaching, and we're going to talk about some specific teaching scenarios in just a few minutes. But one thing to note is just because I say, well, I'm writing a news report about this book, so I have rights to use your book content in my news reporting. It's not quite that simple. There are some factors to consider. There are 4 factors to fair use. And this is where I think a lot of folks want like a clear cut, this is acceptable, this is not. And it's just not that simple. Instead, you as the user of that content, unless you're going to consult with legal, you're making that decision. You're putting the 4-factor test to work. And these are the 4 factors, and we're going to talk about each of them. So number 1, what are you using it for? What's the intent of your use? What is the nature of the copyrighted work? And we'll talk a little bit about what that might look like when we're describing the nature. The amount, and not just the amount, but the substantiality of the portion taken. And we'll talk about how those 2 words are both important. And the effect of the use upon the potential market. And this is the key piece that often kicks us out of fair use land when we're talking about copyrighted content, because we live in a digital world. So once upon a time, before the internet existed, the possible effect of me using copyrighted content on the potential market, on potentially the content creator making money off of his or her creative content, was much less than it is now when I have the capability of taking copyrighted content and sharing it with the world by posting it online. So that number 4 is a big one, especially when we talk about sharing things digitally. So I said it's not black and white. It's not a simple yes or no. And so here are a few things to remember. One is that ultimately the person who's going to make the final call on whether something or not is fair use or not is a judge. And we don't want to end up there, for the decision to be made. So when we talk about the 4-factor test of fair use, it's important to know that the ultimate decision would be made by a judge, and that means obviously that there would be some sort of lawsuit that got you there in front of the judge, and we certainly don't want that. So we want to use our knowledge and make the best decisions we can about fair use so that we're not dealing with bullet number 1. The next one is that you have to consider all factors. So you can't just look at the 4-factor test and say, I'm using this for educational purposes. I'm good. You have to consider all 4 factors. You can't weigh heavily more on one than the other. The courts may show precedents that they rely on, let's say, 4 more than the others, because typically if someone's going to sue, it's probably going to be because of the potential impact on the market. But that doesn't mean that we don't need to weigh off 4 of these factors when we're considering fair use. So you got to think of all 4. And just like I've just mentioned, don't hang your hat on educational use. And I see this a lot. I hear this a lot when teachers say, well, it's okay because it's copyrighted, yes, but it's for educational use, and so it's fair use. So I'm all good. It's not that simple, because you have to consider all 4 of these factors, and purpose and character is just one of those. Now, I've said that it's not that simple, yes or no, but I don't want that to stop you from exercising your rights. So I hate coming across situations where there's information shared that basically scares everybody to death about using copyrighted content in education. We hear of horror stories of people getting sued or people getting in trouble, and so the takeaway from that is often that teachers say, never mind, I'll just either create my own stuff or use some openly licensed stuff or stuff that I know our district has subscribed to and paid for. But don't let this ambiguity keep you from exercising your rights. I think it's a good thing that there are no clear yes or no answers, because that means there's space in there where, maybe I can't use this content in this way, but I can use it in this way. So maybe I can't post it on my school website, but maybe I can make copies of a certain section of this copyrighted material for students in my class. So I like that there aren't clear yes or no answers, although, of course, as a rule-bound person, it would be nice to just be able to say, can I do this? Yes. Or can I do this? No. But we're going to find the silver lining here, which is that sometimes that's going to open doors for you to kind of switch things up a little so that you can pass the 4-factor test. We're going to take each factor of fair use, and I'm going to explain what are more likely to be good reasons to claim fair use and which things are going to be less likely to allow you to claim fair use. So the first one is purpose and character of the use. When we talk about purpose and character, the things that would help make the case for fair use would be if it's for nonprofit educational purposes. So yay us, right? That's definitely something to hang our hat on. If it's transformative, and that means that I'm making new expression or meaning or message from it. So this might be like a parody, or like we were talking about earlier, criticism, comments, news reporting. If I'm taking this content and making something new out of it, it has new meaning, new message that's really distinct from the original work or the original meaning of the work, then that could be considered transformative and certainly more likely to be fair use. It has to have a new and different function. So if it's a substitute for the original work, so for example, if it's a book and I make copies of the book so that my students can read the paper copy rather than the book itself, that's going to be most likely interpreted as a substitute for the original work and not fair use. But if it's a new and different function from the original work and not a substitute, you're more likely to make your case. A couple of things on the right side here of this slide that talk about, something that's going to have a less qualifying claim for fair use are that you take something like a novel and turn it into an ebook or an audiobook. So again, just a different mode of presentation from the original work. That's likely not going to be considered fair use. And or if you take something verbatim, or maybe not even in the whole work, but you take a substantial amount of that work, and we'll talk about substantiality in just a minute. But basically, if you're taking things exactly as they are and using them, then that's probably not going to be fair use. So again, it's not as simple as just saying this is for educational purposes, so I'm all good. It's not that simple. You really need to think about, is this a transformative nature, and how much of the work am I using, and is it a substitute or not? These are things you have to consider when you're thinking about the 4 factors. So the nature of the copyrighted work is the second factor for fair use. And this one's pretty simplistic in my summary here. One is that if it's nonfiction and published, it's more likely to be considered fair use. And think about that. We know that you can't copyright facts and ideas, but you can copyright the expression of those facts and ideas. So if it's a nonfiction book and it's already published, then that means I'm not potentially, just kind of taking the facts and ideas from that nonfiction published material and giving a new expression to it, doing some sort of transformative work to it. If it's fiction and not published, then, that's definitely original creative work, and that author or that content creator has not even had a chance to share that content with anyone. So you're very much going to fall out of fair use land when you're taking something that's fiction and definitely something that's not published. You're going to have a hard time making a case for using that content. The third factor is around that amount and substantiality. So let's talk a little bit about this, because I think sometimes we have probably heard that I can take a certain amount of work. If you look down here at these statements at the bottom, like a set amount, for example, 10% of a creative work or 1 chapter of a book, but it's not really landing in court as being fair use when you make those arguments. It's really been focused on how much of the work has been made available to the public, and the greater amount that you're using of the total work, the less likely it's going to be fair use. But it's more than that. You really have to consider the essence of the work. Forget 10%. If the essence of the work, if the heart of that creative content is being used, then you're less likely to claim fair use. Take, for example, if I had a short story that was 10 pages long and it was just 1 chapter. So, I've read that I can use 1 chapter of a book and it be fair use, not break copyright law. But it's a substantial amount. It's definitely the heart and the essence, because I'm using the whole thing. Or maybe it was 10 pages and I only used 8. But still, it's the essence of the work. Then certainly it's going to be tough to make a fair use claim. If I'm going to copy the entire work, then I've got to make sure that, that I'm making a transformative use of that work and that it's not a competing substitute for the original. And that's kind of tough when you're talking about a great amount or a substantial amount of the portion used. Just consider not only the amount, but also the substantiality. Is it the heart and the essence of the work? So the effect on the potential market is huge, potentially, if I can share it with the whole world, which now is as simple as uploading something and click and save, right? So the effect on the potential market, and you'll notice I don't have any plus signs on this specific slide. It's really about being cognizant that you don't want to widely distribute, certainly not to the general public, which is easy to do online, but you really want to even be careful about distributing to multiple classes and sections. If it appeals to the same audience as the original work, then certainly that could play a part in the potential market. And using copyrighted materials over and over again could certainly have an impact on the potential market. So maybe this year in class, our conversation has kind of gone down this path, and there's some specific questions around such and such, and I pull an article or part of, a few pages from a book that are extremely relevant to our conversation, but it's a pretty good chunk of information from that book that may not typically fall under all four of the fair use factors. But maybe I can make an argument here that, it may seem a little gray, but I'm only using it specifically for this one class period for this year. You can make a stronger case for fair use. So just keep in mind that the effect on the potential market it's not just about the digital landscape, but certainly the digital landscape has enabled people to break copyright law a whole lot easier because the repeated use and access to the general public is very easy to do. One thing about fair use that maybe we haven't talked about specifically in the fair use four-factor test is around licensing. When I engage with content online, or for example, when I subscribe to a streaming service like Netflix or some other service where I can read ebooks online that are copyrighted, in those cases, you are agreeing as someone who comes to the table and says, I would like to use your content. You are agreeing to a license, a terms of service, a user license for that content. And that changes things when we talk about copyright and fair use, because the license is going to override a fair use argument. And that's because you are willingly going into a partnership, an agreement with the provider of that copyrighted content. And so I pulled just a part of a quote here that talks about an argument against this. It says, the partial dissent in Bay State went even further. I nonetheless agree with the majority opinion that a state can permit parties to contract away a fair use defense, or to agree not to engage in uses of copyrighted material that are permitted by the copyright law if the contract is freely negotiated. So basically, this is saying whether we agree that or disagree that this is going to impact copyrighted content going into the public domain, at the end of the day, a copyright owner can put a license on their work, and as long as you freely negotiate with that license and agree to the terms, then you have to abide by what those terms are, which is why I can't, by the agreement in my streaming service with Netflix, I can't show Netflix movies in my classroom. Now, there are some Netflix documentaries that have the rights listed as being able to be shared to an audience, outside of individual use. But know that licenses are going to play a huge part. These terms of agreement, these licenses play a huge part in understanding what you can and cannot use, not just for educational materials, but just in general, because it's about going into this agreed upon license. So when we lay over a scenario of reading a children's book aloud, like a fiction picture book, and reading it aloud, showing all of the illustrations, reading it in its entirety, and posting it on a public-facing site like a YouTube channel or a Facebook page or something like that. And in this scenario, if we think about the four fair use factors, I think we will find that this would not fall under fair use. So let's take a look at those. This is just a copy of those previous slides where it kind of lays out the claim for fair use versus the poor claim for fair use. And if we're thinking about reading that entire picture book online, showing all the pictures, reading the entire book, we could certainly say it's for educational purpose. And we're not transforming this in any way. It's definitely the full copy of the work, and it's verbatim, and it's a new mode of presentation because that was a printed book and now I'm turning it really into like an audio and visual book, and I've turned it into a video that I've posted. So I think in purpose and character, we have a hard case to make. When we think about the nature of the copyrighted book, in this specific instance, I said it was a fiction picture book that is published. So again, do not have a strong case here for fair use. For the amount and substantiality, now I just said I read the whole thing and showed you all the pictures and I made a video. So I used the entire work, and I can't hang my hat on the one plus sign that's on this slide, which talks about transformative use, that it's not a competing substitute for the original. I don't think I can make the case for that. I've definitely used the heart or the essence because I used the whole thing. So again, don't think I can make a case there. And I definitely need to consider the effect on the potential market, because if the copyright owner wanted to make a case, I have just shared this with the general public online through the YouTube channel or the Facebook page or whatever, and it's that in combination with the other three factors, I think I would definitely lose if I was to go to court over this. Now, someone would have to sue, right? And we would have to go to court over it, but it's not as simple as, I probably won't get caught. Who's gonna fuss, right? I'm doing good things for kids. But it's not that simple. This isn't about the educational value outweighs copyright law. The copyright owner has rights, and if you can't make a fair use argument, then you're really not modeling what we need to be teaching our students. And it's really, honestly, it's breaking the law, so therefore it's not ethical to do what we know would not fly in front of a court if we were trying to make a fair use argument. Now, if I change that scenario just a tiny bit, and instead of saying that we're going to post it publicly, I say that we're going to post it in a learning management system like Canvas or Google Classroom, where it's going to be behind a password protected space, and only my students are going to have access to it because they're going to have to log into it. But everything else is the same. I'm going to read the whole book, show the illustrations on the page, and it's a fiction picture book. Then when we think about the four-factor test, we probably would have a little bit more in the gray area. Some leaning towards more fair use, some leaning against. And it's a tough call to make because when we think about, and let me just back up here, when we think about the purpose and character, nothing's really changed here. Nothing's changed here. Nothing's changed here. It's all about the effect on the potential market. If it's behind that password protected environment, it's less likely, right, that content would then be impacting the potential market. But a case could be made that it still is accessible in a format that maybe someone could take from that password protected environment and then share it publicly. And then who holds that responsibility? So that's definitely I think a better chance at arguing fair use, but I still think it can be a potentially tricky space. So, I encourage you to think about all four of the factors before you do something like even putting something behind a password protected environment, and really, lay out the four factors and see if you could make a case on fair use. I personally think that the original scenario was pretty clear cut. This and this make the argument that would be considered fair use. And I disagree with them, but it would require a judge to make the final call in those types of situations. So I encourage you to read what the other side of this argument sounds like in these two examples. One is talking specifically about through the lens of like a media coordinator doing story time, and how this person has interpreted the law to be that translating story time into a virtual environment, like for remote learning, would still be fair use. And one of the things that I really struggled with, though, in this article is the author saying, who's going to sue a school? Okay, that's not one of the four factors of fair use. So be careful hanging your hat on educational use, thinking that the world is going to look at it and say, oh, but they're just using it for education, so it's okay. It's not that simple, especially when you're posting something on YouTube for public access. For students who have print disabilities, there's a website called Bookshare that has, now it's actually over 900,000 ebooks and periodicals and magazines that are specifically designed for students who have a print disability that means a physical disability, a print disability in terms of dyslexia, a print disability in terms of a visual impairment. Through a federal grant, it's provided free to any K-12 student with a print disability, and it's going to enable students to access all kinds of books, magazines, newspapers, textbooks. Again, there's almost 1 million printed materials on there now, and would be able to download and put into a Braille, refreshable Braille reader. It is accessible as an audio file. It's accessible in a text-to-speech reader. So there's lots of opportunities to provide printed materials that are copyrighted, but through copyright law are available in different formats for those who have print disabilities. For K-12, it's really a simple process of setting up student accounts, and students can log in themselves and download what they need. So it's a great resource and an example of how copyright law allows for accessibility of content, of copyrighted content. So in this scenario about textbook copy, can I copy it? Can I scan it? Can I print it? Can I post it? Something from a textbook. It's not, remember, just the considerations of fair use, the 4-factor test we have to consider. We also have to consider the terms of use and the licenses. So more than likely, if it's a textbook, it's going to be a textbook that you have an organizational license for, like for the school or for the district, and would only allow certain uses. Even under fair use, I wouldn't be able to use it for certain things, because there is a certain license, a certain agreement on how that content can be used once it's purchased. So just know that, especially when we were thinking about remote learning and making copies of things and sending them home, or putting a copy of something in Google so that my students can access it rather than having the actual textbook at home, you've got to consider not just the 4 use factors, but also terms of use or license agreement. So I'll give an example of a situation that came out in the news. Gosh, I guess it's been a couple years now, but this is a Houston school district that took a copyrighted study guide for, I think it was for biology, it was for a high school science class, and made copies of it, even though it clearly states, as you can see right here at the bottom of the study guide, that copying this material is strictly prohibited. And it was actually a pretty small company that had developed this. It was obviously a lot of facts, which are not copyrighted, but the expression of those facts in the study guide is what made this content copyrightable. And this school district repeatedly violated copyright laws by making copies, and in some instances even covered up that statement about copying is strictly prohibited before they made photocopies of it. And they ended up having to pay to the tune of $9.2 million. And I don't know how many copies were made. It said, I don't know if it was even included in the article how many copies were made, but I don't think that was the issue. I think the issue was, they blatantly violated copyright law, and the company won the lawsuit at $9.2 million. So, it's important to, I don't want to scare folks into thinking, well, never mind, I don't want to even mess with copyrighted stuff. It's not about that. It's about being knowledgeable about the essentials of copyright law so that you know when to ask for legal advice, but also when you can layer the 4-factor test for fair use and make a fair argument that or a fair claim that you've considered those 4 factors and it fallen in the fair use space. It's important too to remember that just because you put a citation does not mean that it's going to supersede the rights of the copyright owner. So citations are important, absolutely. And even under fair use usage of copyrighted content, it's important to cite the material that we're using. But just because you cite it doesn't mean that you get to not follow copyright law. the fair use 4 factors or copyright law. And it's also not going to help your case if you add disclaimers. And I don't know about you, but I see this often, especially like on YouTube, where someone is sharing a recording of something that, came from a TV show or something, or have added music to a video, and then in the description it'll say something like this: I don't own the copyright to this work, or I don't own rights to this song. So, it's important to recognize that a disclaimer is not going to get you off the hook. That does not mean that since I'm not claiming that it's my stuff, I can still share somebody else's stuff. The copyright owner has exclusive rights. So citations and disclaimers do not always make the case. So we've talked a little bit about public domain. We've talked about all rights reserved, copyright, the exclusive rights that copyright owners have. The some rights reserved section is an interesting space that really came out because of the ability to share things online with people who you probably will never meet. And so if I create something that I'm willing to share with people, I can actually add an open license to it to say, okay, I've created this content and I want to share it, but if you use my stuff, I still want you to give me credit. I don't want you to make money off my stuff. You can set some parameters that would allow kind of a public license with some restrictions to it. So I'm not giving up copyright, and I can still say, use my stuff, but follow these rules. And those open licenses really allow people to take that content and do things like remix it. I could retain it, I could reuse it, I could change it up, I could remix it with some other open content, I could redistribute it, whether that's online or in person. And this some rights reserved space, and definitely the public domain space, allows you to do some or all of these R words. And this space is really driven by Creative Commons licenses. And Creative Commons is a nonprofit organization that said, we need some common language that could become common language around the general public around open licensing. And so even sites like Flickr would allow you to actually look for but also share your creative works with an open license. And so I could actually come in here and search for something specific like glitter, and I could narrow down, show me only the things that are licensed for commercial use. And so here's an example of a picture that I took at my son and daughter-in-law's baby shower. And I uploaded this to Flickr, and I picked this license, attribution, which simply means you can take this picture, do whatever you want to with it. You can make money off of it. You can crop it. You can recolor it. You can write on it. You can post it online. You can print it. The only thing I ask is that you give me credit. And so included on that page, I have information about how to give me attribution for my picture. I love that you can actually go out into the world and look on sites like Flickr and look for openly licensed content. So you're not then worrying about copyright law because the copyright owner has said, I still own the copyright, but I am giving you some rights to the general public, and you don't even have to ask me for permission because these are just blanket rights that I'm given to everyone. So that is a general overview of copyright law, fair use, and hopefully the takeaway for you today is that you can use copyrighted materials in your classroom, but you have to consider what part of copyright law allows you to do that and in what context and with what parameters. So as you think about using instructional materials, looking for instructional materials, think about the 4-factor test for fair use. But I also encourage you to start taking a look at OER. So thanks for joining today, and I hope that there have been some key takeaway points that will impact you in your classroom starting either this summer, if you're involved in summer learning, or in the fall. And if you have any questions or if I can help in any way moving forward, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.